Watch out, Snick. Watch out, Snickers. My Grisham books. Some of them, anyway. When was it? This was written 2 years ago. John decided to write The Appeal. He talked to me about it because he wanted me to help him get the details right in the book. He likes the books to be accurate. It's interesting because it sort of tracks what I went through. It's about a Mississippi Supreme Court justice running for re-election and being attacked by these out-of-state big business interest groups that are coming in trying to defeat the incumbent Supreme Court justice so that they can get their corporate interests on the, on the court. So, yeah.
As the legislature would try to effect tort reform, if they did get into law, then it came down to the courts to decide whether or not that law was constitutional. And there started to be decisions around the country that said that these laws were not constitutional, that they went too far.
So then the businesses said, well, we can't pass those laws. What we can do is to try and have judges who decide these cases be really conservative, business-oriented judges.
Karl Rove developed this plan and worked with the Chamber of Commerce to influence the outcome of key judicial races around the country. They put in place a pretty aggressive campaign, ranking which states are most important for them to be in, and putting tens of millions of dollars a year into these elections that often had tiny amounts of money.
I started getting calls from Karl in the middle to late 1980s as he began his work representing, at the beginning, state Supreme Court candidates in Texas. Rove was able to put together a franchise, basically, to elect Republicans who he was representing with a guarantee that they would have well-financed races, and business interests got Supreme Court judges who were going to rule their way on business cases and on tort cases. By the time you reach the 1990s, this core of conservative, Republican, tort-minded judges were ruling overwhelmingly for some of the largest corporate interests in Texas.
It's a model that they used and they exported to other states.
It's a good payoff. It's a good payoff. You put money in a judicial race, you spend $100,000 to help challenge a judicial candidate, it can have literally $1 million impact on your company.
And it seems that that's happening more and more throughout the country, that our state Supreme Courts are reversing civil juries in this country at an unprecedented level after seeing the gifts of millions of dollars.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
If you get 5 people in our state who have 9, so the majority is 5, you get 5 judges that have that persuasion to be always with the doctors or be always with the corporations. You have court reform, and that is more deadly than tort reform ever thought about being. And that's what this Karl Rove, the chamber, is about. And they came into these southern states, and Mississippi was a good state to take on because it's a small state, not much money, and the U.S. Chamber put in candidates that were friendly towards them, and they were able to elect all of them except for one, and that was Oliver Diaz's election.
The Appeal was a book I published. It's a novel. It's completely fiction, and it's completely true. It's a story of the purchasing of a Supreme Court seat in Mississippi. I felt like I kind of lived through it with Oliver, knowing, because he was my friend, knowing he'd gone through.
I was born and raised in Biloxi, Mississippi. Lived there all of my life, and then went to law school, and after law school came back home and started practicing law there. And in 1987, I was elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives and started a career in politics at that point.
I was his campaign manager.
You had these interest groups that were interested in electing judges that they deemed to be pro-business. I was not deemed to be pro-business, and the U.S. Chamber mounted a very, very large and expensive campaign against me in 2000.
Diaz even voted to overturn a cocaine conviction because evidence of a prior cocaine sale was allowed. Oliver Diaz, very bad judgment.
The negative ads are still running, and that part has not changed. The ads are still on the television. It's a terrible situation.
It is demeaning to the office. It is improper. That should not have happened. I've told Judge Diaz that I've done all I can do to get those stopped. I don't like it.
My opponent, who was supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he had probably $1 million spent on his behalf, which was not even, it was more than $1 million spent on his behalf, but it wasn't in his name, and he didn't report that on his campaign finance reports.
You know, people think, oh, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They think of it representing small chambers on a national scale. That really isn't what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is.
So what's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
I'm not really sure. Something dealing with the government.
It was my understanding that it was a government agency, but I'm not sure of that.
Probably they are engaged in managing something.
Trade? Do they engage in managing trade throughout the United States?
I'd go with that.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce became a very, very important player in the tort reform movement, and they have now been shown to be funneling money into judicial campaigns.
Here's the way the campaigns happen, okay? You have your doctors, hospitals, manufacturers, insurance companies. You got all those folks kind of quarterbacked by the Chamber of Commerce. That's where the money is. There's nobody on the other side except for trial lawyers, because the trial lawyers know the law and they know what's going to happen if these judges are elected.
We were playing by a certain set of rules. There were campaign finance laws that you had to know where the money was coming from, and there were limits on some of the amounts of money by who gave it.
The trial lawyers are limited as to how much money they can put in. If you give more than $5,000, a judge can't sit on your case. Whereas if the money comes from the chamber, all that money was packaged into a large group, and there's no way that you can see who were the contributors.
The chamber puts in millions of dollars into state races through some kind of a front group. You know, Citizens for a Strong Ohio or Partnership for Ohio. Groups that sound like they are citizens groups, but in fact are really business groups hiding behind a false veneer.
We're doing much, much better in the courts and in the election of judges to the state Supreme Courts. We're in those races. We'll spend $19 million on the election of those judges and state attorneys general in this next election.
They spent so much money against us. They would run almost every 15 to 20 minutes on TV on our local station. So we got to where we just didn't have the TVs on, and all of a sudden one morning...
We didn't want the kids to see these horrible ads.
Some of the ads actually had big money bags being thrown up on a bench that he was bought and paid for.
As generous friends, Diaz's campaign took over $100,000 from personal injury lawyers who...
And so one morning we hear, just woohoo, and our daughter's just like cheering downstairs, and we come down and she's like, we're rich. And she'd seen the ad with the big bags of money, on the bench and her daddy's name.
The game plan was to pick out a justice, try to make that justice look soft on crime, take snippets from decisions that the justice had made, manipulate those decisions to make them seem absolutely outrageous and ridiculous, and spend a lot of money to get that message out to the voters. The amount of money that's spent on television in a political campaign has an enormous effect on the outcome. And in fact, in 2000, the statistics showed that the side that spent the most money won about 90% of the time.
We had 2 weeks until we had to run again for a runoff, and we find out that the U.S. Chamber had literally almost purchased all of the available airtime that there was available from Jackson to Biloxi, Mississippi.
And what we had to do at the time was actually take out loans to finance the campaign. And if you're familiar with banking at all, they generally don't like to loan money to folks who may lose an election. So you have to have somebody with money that co-signs on your behalf. And my very good friend Paul Miner was willing to step up and sign a loan at the bank to allow us to compete with the U.S. Chamber's ads that were running at the time.
Keith Sterrett's special interest group from Washington, D.C. recently started attacking me and distorting my record. I refuse to be negative, but I must defend my record.
I still don't know how we did it to this very day, but we actually won that election. I really honestly thought when we won and celebrated that election, we had thought that was a good day, and it turned out to be probably one of the worst days of our life, the election was.
Federal prosecutors decided to investigate me and used the loans that Paul Miner had co-signed at the bank and called that a bribe and said that he'd bribed me as a judge. But what's really interesting about that is I never voted for a single case in which Paul Miner or his law firm or anybody he was associated with had brought before the Supreme Court because of our friendship.
And then that summer, Oliver was indicted, and it just kind of started spiraling downhill from there. I almost kind of didn't believe Oliver. I said, there has to be something here. You're not telling me the truth. They wouldn't bring these charges against us and do this. All of these counts, you're facing 100 and some years in the federal penitentiary. We have
millions of dollars
in fines. We have 2 small children.
Oliver Diaz says the charges against him are groundless because he withdrew from all cases involving Paul Miner. Diaz is on leave from the Supreme Court until the case is resolved.
The decision to prosecute Justice Diaz may have been motivated by tort reform politics. It may have been motivated by an effort to remove Justice Diaz from the Supreme Court, where he often voted for ordinary citizens and against corporations. But it certainly was not a prosecution that was based on the evidence, because the evidence did not support it.
Do you think that Oliver was prosecuted for political reasons?
Sure. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
We thought we were just targeted and this was just us and this political prosecution was just us. We have later found out that this happened all over the country, and those other judges that won or were successful were also targeted.
After a 3-month trial, I was completely acquitted of all charges. Jury returned not guilty verdicts on everything. But 3 days after my trial, I was re-indicted on tax evasion charges. So I had to go through another federal trial after that first 3-month trial, and had a week-long trial this time on tax charges. And after a 15-minute deliberation time by the jury, I was fully acquitted a second time. And I was finally cleared to return to the bench, but not after I had been removed from the bench for almost 3 years. So what they weren't able to do through an election, they were able to do with a federal prosecution, federal investigation, to keep me off of the bench, to ruin my reputation, to make it that I probably wouldn't be able to be elected again to the Mississippi Supreme Court.
Some other people were elected who were considered to be much more business-friendly justices than had served on the court in the years past, and it really did alter things.
In Mississippi, after the court swung, they went like 2 years without upholding a plaintiff verdict. You know, you might be able to win with the jury, but you have no hope of having that verdict sustained by the courts.
I think sort of the taint of these charges and sort of the residue of all of that, and the fact that some people in the public simply assumed he was guilty because he was charged of it, caused him to be defeated for re-election.
Also, I was not able to raise the funds to compete. I raised about a quarter of the amount that I'd raised in my first election.
If $2 or $3 million is being spent or $10 million is being spent, this way it's going now, in 10 years from now, they'll be spending $100 million on judicial elections. And it's not really a good way to have the system work. And there's many people in the business community who don't agree with me on that.